Hey, so if you don't know what this is a compilation video of every single best perks video I've made on the vacuum tube weapons. So a couple of months ago, I actually finished this set with the vacuum tube spear going out. That weapon is incredibly strong, better than you might think, and it's actually viable in the end game. So I finally unintentionally wrapped up the series, so I figured I'd throw all those videos together here. If you have seen every single one of these vacuum tube weapon videos, you don't need to watch this entire video, and of course it'll be timestamped below. I am going to order this in the order that you see that in the collection book. So you'll see the AR, the SMG, the pistol, which is also still curiously labeled the lightning pistol. It is very much so an SMG and behaves like one, but either way, I'll be putting it in order of the collection book. So some of these videos might be a little out of date, and I'm only doing the latest versions as well. So the vacuum tube bow did actually get a remake because when it first came out, garbage weapon, that video is still locatable. I'm pretty sure it's listed in the new video, but the new most updated version of each of these videos will be up in this video. So if you guys want to sit back and enjoy vacuum tube weapon talk, you can go for it. There are a couple of notes I want to make. I mentioned one of them already, but the pistol, I actually just realized I don't think the vacuum tube pistol had the chain lightning when that video was made. However, remaking an entire video on an unpopular weapon because one 6 perk that everybody knows about got added to the game is a little tricky. I'm pretty sure all my perk recommendations would be the same. It's just that, like, instead of damage to afflicted, you might want to just do miss monsters or something. The chain lightning is really nice for a weapon like a pistol for extra area of effect, but if I haven't remade a video and you guys think I should have, comment down below. But I think this set is good, so I'm just gonna let it play. Okay, come on, can we get this box off the screen? Like, I'm trying to record a video. Is there really no setting in the entire game to remove this crap? Jeez, okay, fine. So, welcome back to another video of, hey, this weapon is way better than anybody thought it was, and I don't know why anybody doesn't talk about this weapon more. Featuring the vacuum tube AR, which is one of my favorite weapons that I've always had in the back of my pocket, where I've always kind of known about this weapon, but, I mean, you know, it's not like it's a hidden weapon. Everybody knows it exists, but it's very, very underappreciated, and I think it's because of one important reason, and that's it's semi-auto. A lot of people just won't do it. It doesn't matter how strong a weapon is. It doesn't matter how much damage it does. If they made the Mythic AR not a fully automatic weapon, people wouldn't use it. It's unfortunate. People don't want to click for every single shot, and I understand that, but with the new changes to the 6 perks, you have a chain lightning option, which, as you can see, is obliterating crowds. I do want to give one major warning, though. Maybe it was the loadout that I was using. Maybe it was my copy of the weapon. We'll talk about those perks later, but it seems like these 200 plus power level healing hose just don't die. Like, whatever healing rate that they have is basically the equal damage output that I seem to be doing with this weapon, and they hard walled me every single time I got into an encampment. Now, those zombies are a bit higher than the vacuum tube AR is meant to handle. This weapon is really, really good up until the 132 zones, up until the 140 zones, but against the healing people, against the harder enemies of the 144 players, it's just a tough weapon to use. However, that's not true for the miss monsters. Because of the fact that we're utilizing the chain lightning on this weapon, it actually does really, really well against smashers and miss monsters, and it's not a bad thing at all. So, backpedaling a little bit, the vacuum tube AR is, of course, locked to nature. It is one of the vacuum tube weapons. That's kind of one of its things. So if you bring it into a water zone, it's actually fairly good. I also want to warn against using it in healing death burst missions. That will essentially nullify your chain lightning if you choose to use that, but there are other options, of course. And the chain lightning is one of those things that really gives it area of effect. Because it is a semi-auto weapon, you don't want to, you know, pull a trigger for every single shot. It can chain off and do lots of damage to multiple enemies. And it's interesting because to use that, you're not going to have affliction, you're not going to have slowed and snared. If you focus on a single target, you're not going to get the bonus damage that you used to. Of course, as I said, you will do more damage to miss monsters, but a lot of where that damage is going is to the crowd of enemies around it. So you give up a little bit of single target damage against most targets, but you gain extra single target damage against the hardest hitting enemies, and of course the crowd clearing effect. And like I said, as you can probably see from the gameplay, this thing is critting and headshotting over 100,000 damage into the, you know, mid 100,000s or higher, which a lot of weapons just don't do. Now, the fully automatic weapons can crit for like 80, 90, 100k, depending on the weapon that you're using, of course. It very, very wildly depends. In my experience, 100k seems to be like the benchmark for good weapons, if you will. But of course, fire rate is a big factor. Don't take that, you know, as an ultimate rule. I'm just saying that this weapon actually hits really, really hard, even when it doesn't crit. I was playing in a 4-player, which is kind of interesting to note that, like, I was solo having trouble against 200 power level enemies, but in a 4-player group, that is where you're going to get the extra bonus damage from all of your teammates, and this weapon will probably shine in those high-end zones, much less than I was able to portray it today. So in a group of friends and a lot of people, somebody dropped me this weapon, it was one-shotting pretty much every single normal zombie. The Husky Husks and the Mist Monsters and beyond took multiple shots, of course, but pretty much everything got one-shotted without a problem, and that is a really, really nice feeling when you're using one of these weapons. I unfortunately have not gotten a Chain Lightning Vacuum Tube Rifle. I've been trying, but I do have an Affliction one and a Slowed and Snared, and I might level those up, but I don't know how much I care about this weapon in that regard. I really want to get the Chain Lightning because it's a lot more fun to use. That being about as much of an intro as I can give it, let's talk about the best perks for this weapon and how you're going to want to run it. I'm going to turn on my fan because it is really hot in this room. So without further ado, let's talk about your options. I want to start with the 6 perk because I've been mentioning it a lot here. There are basically no bad options except for the 5 headshots in a row. I don't think 5 headshots in a row is super reasonable or easy to control. Even the headshot eliminations is nice if you're willing to put up with it. If you hit them in the head, they will, you know, explode around them and do a decent amount of extra damage, but Affliction, Slowed and Snared, and Chain Lightning are really the 3 that you're going to want to be looking for. Affliction and Slowed and Snared perk the same. You want to have the damage to Afflicted or the damage to Slowed and Snared based on whatever you've got. That means that every single bullet following your first shot on that enemy will do 45% more, roughly. It's not exactly how the math works out, but I'm not going to confuse it today. And that's kind of the important part. That's a really nice amount of damage to get, but the damage to Mist Monsters and bosses is not too shabby either. That is definitely a nice alternative if you're looking to get some extra bonus damage if you're trying to get the Chain Lightning. Chain Lightning is obviously my preferred, as I said. As I've shown, it chains out to a lot of enemies and does tons of useful extra damage. That's a nice way to go, and I highly recommend it. But if you're willing to do, you know, Affliction or Slowed and Snared, you will do plenty of normal damage against a single target, and you also actually have the damage to Stun, Staggered, and Frozen, because I haven't mentioned that yet, but this is a vacuum tube weapon. It's a little tough to see in some of this gameplay, but if you note, some of these enemies will get stunned periodically. It's not consistent enough to change your 5th perk for it, but it does happen, and it will help a lot. I believe this works on mini-bosses, and it definitely works on smashers, so that's a super convenient thing. Almost immediately in my recording, actually, really early on, I went up against the smasher, and it was actually kind of nice to just sort of keep him at bay. It seemed like every time he was trying to charge, I stunned him or knocked him back a little bit, and it was actually a very convenient experience because when you're solo against a smasher, or really if you're against a smasher in any circumstance, it's a nice ability to have. As for the other perks, you do have a couple of options here. First and foremost, this middle perk is, in my opinion, probably the simplest. You have basically 3 options depending on what you want to do. You don't want durability or weapon stability. It's just not going to make that much of a difference. The reload speed is kind of not great, so I highly recommend a reload perk. It's going to be a lot more useful, you'll find, than that extra damage perk. I think that extra damage perk could help eliminate enemies in 1 shot instead of 2, so you won't have to fire as much, depending on your zone. For example, like if you're using it as a 77, like my personal copy is, this is not what I was using in the gameplay, and you're in like those 60 zones or those 80 zones, maybe the weapon's not quite strong enough, for example, maybe that damage perk can help you eliminate enemies faster, but I think reloading fast and getting back into the fight is a good way to go, or mag size to just give you enough ammo to eliminate whatever's in front of you. Now, that headshot multiplier looks really nice because I have a headshot perk on it, but I'm going to go back to the copy that I had before. Thank you to whoever dropped me these copies. I do not know who you were. A lot of people offered these, and eventually someone just gave them to me, and I appreciate it, but without the headshot perk, you can still see that the multiplier is really big. That's not quite 2x, but maybe I could show the number on screen. It's a very decent bonus, meaning you will be doing nearly double damage by shooting for the head, and that's a big bonus. That's where those crits I mentioned earlier can go from like 100,000 to like 170,000. Like, that is a big change. So if you're going to be using this weapon, definitely aim for the head. I don't recommend using a headshot perk because it's not necessarily consistent enough, but it is definitely worth the extra damage bonus. It will make a huge difference. This is also a good opportunity to note the crit chance being a 43% when you have a maxed out crit rating, which means this is a base 15% chance to crit. Obviously, I'm going to recommend a crit build. Anybody who's been watching at least a few of my videos knows that crit tends to just be the highest damage output. It's not my personal favorite. I don't think that it's how I would like to run it, especially with a semi-auto weapon, but like I said, because of the high base damage on this, you know, 24, 28, 20, nearly 25,000 with the damage perk on here, it was one-shotting just about everything if I aimed for the head, and that was really, really nice to have. I can also address, for that matter, you might have noticed that in my gameplay, my reload was kind of slow. That's because I had a damage perk on these, so that's also why I sort of recommend a reload perk. It felt a little slow to me personally, but if you're okay with the reload speed that you've been seeing in the gameplay, then perhaps it's not a problem. I always like to mention that there are other options. You don't need to run a crit build. If you don't like only some of your shots critting, then a fire rate perk could help. That might have made the difference against the healing hose that I was having trouble against. If I could have just shot a little faster, they would have been eliminated in a much, nicer time. Fire rate and damage would probably be my recommended, or if you're willing to aim for the head, fire rate and headshot damage. I do want to note that that is going to be a dead perk so long as you're not aiming for the head, and it could be really, really tricky to use. It's significantly more consistent in that case to just run, crit rating, crit damage, or double crit damage if you really wanted to use this with like totally rocking out. There are plenty of better options for totally rocking out, but double crit damage would obviously be the way to go in that case. Other than that, you could go double damage. It's not going to be nearly as much damage as crit rating crit damage, and by nearly I mean like it's going to be like 9 or 10% less than a crit build, but it'll still be less enough to where you'll probably notice it. Other than that, I'd highly recommend going nature, seeing as all of your option is nature, so I don't think that there's any other way to spec that. And that pretty much wraps up the vacuum tube rifle. It's honestly one of my favorite sleeper weapons. You're never really going to see it in game. Barely anybody uses it, but it's actually so good. It stuns enemies. It crits for a ton. Its headshot multiplier is really high. With a reload perk, it's not even that bad. The only thing holding it back is that it's semi-auto, and some people just can't deal. If you guys want to support the channel, feel free to use code MISTA at your checkout. You guys want to become a channel member, you can right here. Use these emotes in the comments down below. Pretty cool to have. My streams are awesome. Follow me on Twitch. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a nice day. So the monsoon video went over pretty well, and it turns out that players have a fascination with weapons that are strong that almost nobody knew about. Who would have thought? And it kind of surprises me that nobody ever talks about this weapon. The lightning pistol was recommended to me ages ago as a weapon that's really, really powerful, shoots super fast, and compares with some of the best weapons of the game, yet most people don't even know that it exists. And this is a weapon, similar to the Monsoon, that has a base 15 fire rate. Now, the Monsoon had a base 18 fire rate, but 15 is nothing to scoff at because this weapon is one of the better weapons that I've ever used, and I almost never pull it out because it's locked to nature, and that's basically it. I never maxed out the perks, I never really committed, but it's a weapon that I've been meaning to get back to, and I definitely wanted to make a video on. So, as I just showed, it's from the vacuum tube set. It is an expansion set, so you can just grab this weapon out of the book at any time. It is locked to nature as per the fact that it's a vacuum tube weapon, and it's as simple as it says on the tin. It's a fast fire rate, really decent weapon that kind of kicks up and to the right, so you're going to have a tough time controlling it, but it's not so bad. With a base 2.5 reload speed, we don't really need any reload, which means we can put on a mag size perk, buff that magazine size all the way up to 60 and beyond when I finish maxing this out, and let's talk about the best perks for this weapon. So, because of its fire rate, I don't think there's any reason to go anything other than crit rating, crit damage. If with that base fire rate, if you put fire rate and damage on this, you're just going to run out of ammo way too quick. You're going to want slowed and snared or affliction down here, and that's obviously because of the 5th perk. You want this to match. If you have slowed and snared or affliction, you're going to basically buff your damage by 45% after that first hit, and that is such an amazing bonus that you're not going to want to go without it. If you have the lightning pistol without one of those 6 perks, I'd recommend holding off and waiting for a schematic that does have that, because it's going to be a less effective weapon without it. And literally that's it. I don't want to make this video too quick, but I don't know what else to say. It's a high fire rate weapon that you can just perk up today. You can pull it right out of the book and use the proper pistol loadout, link below, and you can have a grand old time. So that's it. I don't have anything else to say about this weapon. If you guys enjoyed this video, like it, hit subscribe if you're new, tell a friend about this amazing weapon. If you guys have any other weapons that I should check out, make a video on, let me know in the comments below. Obviously, let me know if they ever change the name on this thing so I can finally update the video title, because I don't think Lightning Pistol is going to be around forever. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a nice day. So the vacuum tube revolver became available in some of the missions recently, and lots of people asked me about it because apparently this weapon was pretty rare. This is an expansion weapon, so you can get it from the collection book with ease, and it's something that you can also get in normal llamas, but I have never actually used this weapon or ever heard anybody actually talk about it. So I got a copy from Skulls, brought it to a 140 mission, and put it to the test. And I was wildly impressed, because the first time I actually tried this was in a 132 zone with a full party, and this thing was hitting so hard that I'm still convinced that it might be bugged. bugged, and I'm going to try and not use too much of this gameplay throughout the rest of the video, but while we're talking about it, I can show you that I was headshotting, critting for over 900,000 damage, and normal body shots were doing like 90,000, which is an insane spread. You can't just 10 times your damage that easily, or so I thought. I looked a little closer and I realized that the damage is doubled with a headshot, and if the headshot gets multiplied by the crit, yeah, you can hit well into the hundreds of thousands of damage. Again, that might have been bugged. My team was boosting me pretty high, but I was shocked by the amount of damage I was receiving from this weapon, and if that's really how hard this thing is hitting in a full party and what I was experiencing wasn't a glitch, then this thing is way stronger than I ever thought it would be. Now, for the rest of this video, I'll show you what I did solo in a 140 zone, where this thing was actually still hitting very, very hard. This thing wasn't quite doing outlandish damage like it was before, but it was still headshotting and critting for the hundreds of thousands of damage, and it was taking out all enemies completely fine, and I am honestly quite impressed with this weapon. And without further ado, let's talk about the best perks for this weapon and how you should spec it. So obviously with Vacuum 2 weapons, you are limited to nature, and this does have the normal perk spread with the 6 perk where you can have Affliction, Slowed and Stared, Headshot eliminations, and I believe 5 headshots increase your range damage. I'm not sure about that last one, but I know that this weapon does have the ability to have headshot eliminations cause explosions, and that might be preferred for this. Before I get into the rest of this perks, this is a pistol. It is very, very high damage, but most pistols that I've been talking about on the channel are high damage, single target, but really, really bad at crowd clearing. So you're almost certainly going to need some kind of secondary weapon like a rocket launcher to be eliminating hordes of zombies. But if you have headshot eliminations cause an explosion, you can actually get some area of effect damage, and I'll show once again, I've showed this before on the channel. When I reviewed the Duelist, I'd actually found that it's more effective in a crowd when I use headshot explosions because it eliminated more enemies upon elimination, and that was actually, while less DPS than, you know, damage to afflicted or slowed and stared with that 5th perk compatibility, it actually cleared out the crowd really, really well, and I was really impressed by that. So the perks on this are interesting because you can roll double crit damage and reload on this. I'm not going to recommend mag size because it has a 10 mag size, but it consumes 2 ammo per shot, and as far as I could tell, Calamity was still compatible. If you don't know about Calamity, she is technically the highest damage pistol buff hero in the game besides Gunblazer Southie, but he requires a phase dash, and that's really jinky, and I don't like using it. But Calamity gives you a 60% damage buff and a 75% impact buff if you run her in the lead for the first 6 shots. As far as I'm aware, that is the actual first 6 shots, not the first 6 pieces of ammo to be consumed. So if that confused you, then because this shoots 2 ammo at a time, you technically consume 6 ammo after 3 shots. But from what I could experience, she was buffing all 5 of the shots that you can get with this. And my point is, as long as you have 6 or less bullets in the magazine, if you're using a pistol, you definitely want Calamity as your lead instead of Beetlejuice or Ranger Deadeye. Those are the other best heroes for the pistols. I'll link my video on it in the description below. It's an old video, but I think it's still relevant, and you guys can set up a great loadout that way. But I want to keep this thing with that 5 shots just for Calamity, so I definitely recommend reload on this. You can absolutely go mag size. It has a 2.5 second reload time, which is a long time for a pistol, and the reload still felt a little slow even with a maxed out reload perk. So I'm going to recommend that there, but if you don't care about reload or mag size, then damage would give you more damage per bullet, but you're definitely going to want at least reload or mag size on a weapon like this. And what was interesting is you can go double crit damage on this. So if you really like Totally Rocking Out, then you could throw away my pistol loadout video because I don't even think I mentioned that. I don't know if it existed at the time, but if you want to run a Totally Rocking Out build and you want to go double crit damage on this and pair it with some headshots, I wouldn't be surprised if in a full party you can get over 1 million damage on a headshot crit, and that would be an extremely fun way to play and something you might want to try out if you're looking to have some fun. All around, I am going to recommend crit rating crit damage, which I normally wouldn't do for pistols. I really don't stand by that. I think that you really want to smoothen out the damage with double damage or, you know, fire rate damage. It is less damage per second, but it's a lot more consistent because you only have 5 bullets in this thing, and you want all of those bullets to eliminate the enemies you're shooting. But with a 2x multiplier to the headshot damage, and with how hard this thing is hitting with the loadout I was using, pretty much every single enemy was dying anyway. And because I had Affliction, if I didn't quite kill them with a non-crit, they would waste away with the Affliction perk, even though it's doing like nothing. It's still enough to finish off an enemy, and I found that to be perfectly good. And when it does crit, oh my god, that hundreds of thousands of damage definitely makes up for the lack of damage from its normal bullets, takes out mist monsters and smashers very, very comfortably, and it makes it a very, very useful weapon. So honestly, my recommendations is double crit damage reload if you're going to be going Totally Rocking Out, and then just crit rating crit damage reload, because this weapon does have a base 15% crit chance and 75% crit damage, which is higher than normal if you're not aware, and that means you'll have about a 43% chance chance to crit anyway. So I'm talking about the non-crits, but a huge amount of your shots are going to be critting anyway. And then this bottom perk is interesting because if you don't have Affliction or Slowed and Snared on this, then honestly, if you're using Calamity in the lead, damage to stun, staggered, and frozen targets is actually probably fine because the impact that she allows you to, you know, be getting with this weapon will be knocking enemies down fairly consistently, and doing extra damage to those targets could be a good way to go. Or you could go damage to miss monsters and bosses if you want to do a little bit more damage to the biggest targets that you'll be up against. Of course, however, if you are using a Slowed and Snared or Affliction schematic, you are going to want to match the 6th perk, so damage to Afflicted or damage to Slowed and Snared, depending on your 6th perk. So that's the Vacuum Tube Revolver. Those are the best perks for it. I was impressed with this weapon. I'm really happy that I can show you guys another old weapon that is way better than everybody knew. Once again, I had never even used this weapon before yesterday, and from my experience with it, I might be using it again in the future. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. If you want to, you know, support the channel, I can head on over here to the Llama Shop. If you guys want to use code MISTA in your checkout, I'd really, really appreciate it. Like the video if you liked, dislike if you disliked it, subscribe if you're new. Hope you guys enjoyed, and have a nice day. The Vacuum Tube Shotgun. What an absolute monster. With the 12.0 update, this weapon received one of the highest buffs of any weapons in the game, with an 82% damage increase. This weapon's damage got nearly doubled, and barely anybody is talking about it. If you are one of the fans of the Vacuum Tube Shotgun, it's okay. Settle down. You can come back from the comment section. You're all right. This weapon will be getting its time in the spotlight today because a fancy new 6th perk has made it extra relevant. You probably already know what I'm talking about. It can chain lightning upon elimination. I myself do not have a copy of this weapon yet, but holy smokes, when I do, I'm maxing it out immediately because this thing is fantastic. And a lot of the gameplay I recorded initially, I was in a Healing Death Burst mission where everything was basically healing off the damage from the Chain Lightning, so this kind of stands as a warning to anybody using this weapon. If you are in a Healing Death Burst zone, then you might not want to use this weapon because the Chain Lightning isn't really going to be at all helpful. But in any other mission, it's very, very nice, and especially in the lower zones where the enemies aren't quite as beefy, that Chain Lightning, if it can eliminate enemies, makes this weapon incredibly strong. Now, obviously, if you're going to be in one of those lower zones, you're not going to need any help killing enemies, but Chain Lightning does help you attack a lot more enemies than you can initially, well, impact with the regular shotgun. So for the regular shotgun, outside of the Chain Lightning effect, it is also very strong. You're shooting in a 3-burst round where you're hitting, you know, 3 shots at a time, and because it's a Vacuum Tube weapon, or not all Vacuum Tube weapons have this, but in this case, it can stun enemies, which is really, really nice. It can hold them in place long enough to shoot them even more, and it also helps against miss monsters as well, of course. And this weapon is just... it's very, very strong against those miss monsters. We were running a crit build on this because we'll explain later, but I mean, I can even say it now. When you're shooting 3 shots at a time, 1/3 of your shots on average are very likely to crit, so you're probably going to be getting a decent bang for your buck there. And against miss monsters, smashers, the fatties, I wasn't having any trouble with this. And of course, for the lower level zombies, the lower health ones, the Chain Lightning was, of course, able to clean those up. Now, of course, it is an energy cell based weapon, so you will be paying for a lot of this power, but I do think it's worth it. And if you have a copy of this weapon, you might want to give it a go. Now, if you do have a copy of this weapon, how should you perk it? So, as always, it depends on your 6th perk. Obviously, for the element, I'm considering nature. I really don't think there are any other options that are best fit for this weapon. This is going to be your water element slayer. You're going to want to pull out the Vacuum Tube Shotgun anytime you want to go up against the water enemies with everything you've got. And if you have the 6th perk for causes affliction or damage dealt snares enemies, then you're going to want to have, of course, the damage to afflicted or damage to slowed and snared. I think that's pretty obvious. Because this is a Vacuum Tube weapon, though, damage to stunned is something you might want to consider, but we'll talk about that right here. So if you have the headshot eliminations or getting 5 headshots in a row, then unfortunately you have rolled the bad dice. You're probably not going to want to use the schematic, even though it's still going to do plenty of damage. I don't think that that's the way you're going to want to go. What you want, what I want, is the eliminating an enemy causes a Chain Lightning strike. Now, right off the bat, I will tell you that damage to afflicted and damage to slowed and snared does offer a decent amount of extra damage. After your first bullet, a 45% damage buff is really nice to have, but, you know, you won't be chaining multiple enemies. And that Chain Lightning is hard to factor because it will be hitting, well, extra enemies for extra damage. So you will be getting the extra damage, but it won't be against the target you're shooting. It'll be against future potential targets around the enemy that you just eliminated. So it's a little weird to think of it like that, but it's really good against crowds of enemies. Now, the description is vague here against how it can stun enemies, so I don't think it's guaranteed that you will stun an enemy, but seeing as it will be happening, the extra damage to stunned staggered enemies could be pretty decent, actually. You could get a lot of extra damage and mileage out of that different 5th perk. I think the damage to miss monsters and bosses is a decent consideration as well, as normal zombies typically don't put up too much of a fight. You're typically going to eliminate them without too much of a problem, and the damage to miss monsters and bosses will help you against your hardest enemies, but that extra damage to stunned enemies is a little bit more universal, and it could be very, very nice, but I'm not sure if it can stun miss monsters. If I have some gameplay of it, I'll show it here, but it's something to consider. And then, of course, for the middle perk, yes, we're going all around the juicy perks. The middle perk is something else to consider as well. So this is where you have the option to put a magazine size, a reload, or an extra damage perk. The reload's not too bad on this weapon. I was running it with a reload perk. I don't think you need mag size. It has a 15 round mag, but you have a 3 burst shot, so you're going to be reloading every 5 shots, and that's a pretty common thing for a shotgun anyway. You're constantly draining your magazine about as soon as you can, so a reload perk could help you, get back into the action, but typically with shotguns, depending on their reload type, the more mag size you have, the faster to reload. But with the vacuum tube shotgun, it doesn't really display as though it's reloading per shell. It kind of treats it like a whole new magazine. It's a little weird to explain that, but my point is a mag size might be as fast to reload as the reload perk. I don't think I've ever actually shown this in a proper video on shotguns, and I'm a little guilty of this because in my Huskbuster video, I actually drove home really well that you should probably be using reload because it reloads faster. But the way that reload works on shotguns is a little weird, so settle in. Start spamming L if you don't care about any math or science, but this is good to know because the way that it reloads is it gives you about an X amount of reload time. For like the ground pounder, I think it's about 5 seconds, but it's actually 5 seconds for all 12 of the rounds. So with the reload perk, you have less rounds and a faster reload. So for instance, for the ground pounder, it takes this long to reload with a reload perk and this long with a mag size. It's actually almost identical. So you can add on a bunch of extra bullets, buffing your mag size to 12 on the ground pounder and have the exact same reload speed. It's actually really, really cool. So it's kind of interesting to know that, but they could fix this in the future by making the reload speed calculate on a per shell basis rather than the time it takes for all of the shells, but it's really good to know going forward. As I already showed with the vacuum tube shotgun, it seems to treat each shell like a mag size, but like I said, I didn't actually test it myself on this weapon specifically, so your mileage may vary. So just know that you might want to run reload on something like the ground pounder over a mag size, but the time that you're saving is like 1/100 of a second per shell or something like that. It's essentially negligible. Or do you want to have neither and hit harder per bullet? I don't think this damage perk is necessary. You can sort of go off of your own experience. If you're eliminating enemies fast enough, you can totally use it, but in my experience, it's always nice to have a quality of life perk, especially for something as limited as shotguns, where they have a small mag, big damage. You don't need the extra damage, but you need to do something about that magazine or that reload because it's going to be a constant problem. Now, leaving that one up to choice, let's move on to the actual perks. I always like to say that fire rate and damage is kind of the same as crit builds, but for this weapon, I'm going to completely reject that idea because it's nice to shoot fast, I guess, but as I mentioned earlier, you're already shooting in 3-round bursts, so if your crit chance is going to be up to 38%, then on average, at least one of your shots is very likely to crit. It is not guaranteed, but for the sake of, theory crafting here, 38% of the time is more than 1/3 of the time, so on average, one of your shots is going to crit every time. So I think it's consistent enough to just run crit damage on this. You will always, on average, be critting every time you fire a burst. So I really don't see any reason to just not run a crit build on this. Like I said earlier with the chain lightning strikes, that's going to be dealing a lot of extra damage anyway, so it's not really going to be that big of a deal. I ran a crit build with this and was completely fine, and it worked great for me. If you are using Totally Rockin' Out, I'm not going to show any gameplay this time, but if you are going to be running Totally Rockin' Out, you can do double crit damage on this, so that's definitely an option. You don't need to deal with any kind of crit rating. You'll be set and ready to rumble in that case. So yeah, the vacuum tube shotgun is one of those sacred fruits that I don't have myself. If you guys want to see how to get this, by the way, so if you want to research a schematic, you can absolutely do it just like that. Pull a purple one out of the book. I always recommend purple because purple flux is a little bit easier to get. It comes around more often. And then when you go to evolve it, you can see whatever 6th perk that you might have. I'm going to be getting slowed and snared. That's not exactly what I was hoping for. I do have quite a few copies of this. I only have 2 in purple, but I think I have more gold. Oh, I only have 1. Never mind. I thought I had quite a few copies. I think I only had more of some of the other ones. Suffice it to say, I do not have the Chain Lightning one yet, and I will still be hunting for it. But that was the last of my weapon designs. I'm down to 91, so I'm going to have to save that adventure for another day. If you guys enjoyed this video and you guys want to support the channel, feel free to use code MIST at your checkout. I will be trying to link all of my vacuum tube weapons in the description below, and I will be updating that list as I cover them all. I should have almost all of them down there by now, so be sure to check that out if you're interested. If you guys want to support me even further and become a channel member, you absolutely can with a join button or the link in the description below. I am streaming more on Twitch now, however, so you might want to follow there as well if you guys want to catch the streams. It's a really fun time. It's a lot less informative and a lot more just having fun. And of course, if you guys want to ask questions, that's totally fine. So if you guys want to follow over there, you absolutely can. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a nice day. I spent like 2 minutes before recording this video trying to figure out puns for this thing, but I'm probably just not going to do that because many of them are just so shocking that they just had me frozen in my tracks. It was even starting to affect the people around me, and none of them were fire. Okay, I am so sorry. Vacuum Tube Sniper is probably the best freeze ray weapon in the entire game. I am running it with Zenith, so let's actually head over to the loadout right away just so we can talk about how I'm using this weapon before we get into anything else. I think the Vacuum Tube Sniper is really kind of hard to use as a primary. So even if you use it with Sub-Zero Zenith, you probably want to use something else because this weapon is difficult to maintain. You are going to have a scope. It's going to have a little bit of recoil. You're barely going to know what you're doing. You don't want to hip fire this thing, and it shoots 10.8 energy cells per second. I'm not saying shots per second. I am clarifying energy cells per second. You will mow through your batteries if you run this weapon. And later on, we're going to talk about perks. And if you want to put fire rate on this, I will suggest that only for people who hate having energy cells because this is an expensive weapon to run. And even though the entirety of the gameplay in this video is going to be pretty much against normal enemies and mist monsters, other than that one time that I bullied a taker, we'll look at that later, the only time that I ever actually suggest using this is against a smasher. Like, if you're going to be running a Zenith loadout, especially with a Vacuum Tube Sniper, your main priority on the team is to freeze smashers, and for that, it is phenomenal. There is barely a better way to make smashers just completely irrelevant. Even in the highest end zones, if you have somebody freezing the smashers and you're working well as a team, defending the objective, you don't even need to have your team for the smasher because you can be so effective at freezing a smasher in place indefinitely that you can just kind of chip away at it for as long as it takes. So it's a really, really good thing for that. And it's a little embarrassing, actually, what I did to this smasher. He's probably going to want to take that one to the grave. He's going to be dying to get out of this situation. Oh my god. But anyway, so the loadout that I'm using for this is the Zenith loadout, obviously. Just giving it a couple of sniper buffs if you don't know Redline Ramirez. Either Redline Ramirez or Rabbit Raider Jonesy are pretty good in the lead, and for the exact same thing as I said in my Crankshot video, I would highly suggest running Ice Queen if you have room in your loadout. You don't need to use Coconuts, though I highly suggest it. You don't need to use Quickscope, though I highly suggest it. You don't need to use Sure Shot, especially if you don't end up running a crit build on this thing, which you probably should, because Zenith kind of relies on crits because it's sniper crits that are freezing the enemies. And you'll notice a lot of the times that the residual water damage is coming from Zenith, and that is actually why we can be quite effective against fire enemies. Even though you're using a nature sniper, which will do a quarter damage to fire enemies, like for every, like, say you're doing 100,000 damage, you're not, but say you're doing 100,000 damage, you will do 25,000 damage to fire enemies. So it's not very effective with a nature weapon, but Zenith will actually make sure that they tick away a little bit with water damage. Now, I did say that you're not hitting 100,000. At least solo in a party with my stats, I was able to crit headshot with like 96,000, so it's a pretty good weapon. I'm just saying, it actually does a lot of damage. It's just very expensive to operate and a little tricky to use. Now, I did say that you should be using it for smashers, but if you have an unlimited supply of energy cells, or you just want to have fun for a mission or two where you can afford that, this weapon is quite good for crowd clearing. My copy actually has Chain Lightning, and I will show other ways to perk it. Affliction actually does pretty well too, so you don't really need to use Chain Lightning. It's just kind of the new thing that I'm interested in, and it's interesting to note that to freeze enemies in place, you kind of need to focus on them, and to take out a crowd of enemies using Zenith as some of your damage, you want to freeze an enemy, move on to the next target, and freeze that one, move on, move on, move on, which is kind of ironic because if you're going to be utilizing the Chain Lightning, you actually want to finish an enemy, chain out to all the other enemies damaging them, and then just go one enemy at a time. That was a little confusing. It's fine. I'm just saying it's the difference between hitting all the targets before you kill anything or just killing one thing at a time. It doesn't ultimately matter. They're all going to get pretty dead. It just kind of depends on how you want to play and whether or not you want to utilize your loadout to the fullest. Now, cost and everything aside, this weapon is a very, very high damaging weapon, especially with the extra damage to mist monsters that I have on my weapon. It is very, very good at eliminating mist monsters. I'm sure it's good against mini bosses, although they will not be frozen to my knowledge. If they are frozen, then that is probably a bug that's in the game right now, and you might want to have some fun with that. So if that's ever a thing in the future where this this thing freezes mini bosses, you let me know in the comments below. But smashers are probably going to be your ideal target. So if you're going to be running this weapon, let's talk about the perks for it. Now, I actually don't know how or why or where these came from. I have 2 schematics. I don't know. I'm not even going to... I don't know. So the Affliction one is where I was talking, and it's actually a good way to show that you kind of can do the extra damage to Affliction here. There are a couple of options. Headshot eliminations cause an explosion is kind of nice, but you're not really caring about headshots if you're kind of running this with Zenith, although this weapon does fire a lot of shots. It works really more like an assault rifle, seriously. It just has a scope on it. So you can do the headshot bonuses, but if this weapon is getting, research from your collection book, which you can do in the expansion section under the vacuum tube weapons, I would look for either Chain Lightning or Affliction, just because Affliction does extra damage, and Slowed and Snared is kind of irrelevant if you're literally freezing them in place, so you kind of don't need that. The one thing that you're looking for if you do get Slowed and Snared or Affliction is just that damage to Slowed and Snared or Affliction bonus. Obviously, we're running a crit build because if you're running Zenith, you're going to want crit. And I believe, based on the 43% that my max copy has, this has a 15% chance to crit, which is actually really high. When you're shooting 10 shots per second, I mean, you can run a crit build very comfortably and not have any problem at all. A lot of times with snipers, I like to talk about the headshot bonus because it's, usually a 2x multiplier, which in this case it seems to be. You don't really need to even worry about that. Hell, you could run crit rating and then headshot damage, but I think the crit damage would definitely be more useful there. Reload is really nice to stay in the fight, and I did mention earlier, if you want to run fire rate, only do that if you hate energy cells. You will shoot crazy fast. There is a little bit of wind-up time. You'll see in a lot of my gameplay, I don't start shooting right away. That's not me. That's just the weapon not shooting instantly. I don't know if it says anything about it here. No, but the beam takes a second to fire up, which is a little annoying. I feel like it's slightly unnecessary. There aren't many weapons in the entire game that do that. In fact, off the top of my head, I'm sure there might be more. The only one I can think of is the Monsoon, where it has to spin up, but that's because it's a chain gun. I suppose a vacuum tube sniper just needs to charge up the beam before you start shooting, which I guess makes sense, but it makes it a little tricky to use. So I don't really think you need fire rate. You'll be shooting plenty fast once you get going. Crit rating, crit damage, obviously, just because you want to maximize Zenith. If you don't care about Zenith, I still recommend a crit build just because that'll be your best DPS. Now, if you want to do double crit damage and totally rocking out, you can. That'd be a really fun way to go. I'm not even going to suggest not doing that. I'm just saying... you can, I don't know, do double crit damage, Rabbit Raider in the lead, and then run totally rocking out. You could have a very fun time with that. And of course, if you are doing the enemy's Chain Lightning thing, then damage to miss monsters and bosses is probably the best way to go. I do believe all of the vacuum tube weapons have a chance to stun enemies, but that could be very false, and it doesn't say anything about stunning enemies down here. So I doubt that you're going to be really utilizing that damage to stun targets very often. I do think the damage to miss monsters and bosses is fine because, the normal enemies will die plenty fast, usually. If you level this weapon up and you're fighting in your power level zone, say you're a power level 70, your vacuum tube rifle is powered up to like 60 or 80 or wherever you can make it, you should be fine. You should be fine against 60, 70, 80 power level targets. So I don't really think you need any special bonuses here except for the Affliction or Slowed and Snared, obviously. The damage to miss monsters and bosses, those are the enemies that are really going to be giving you trouble, and I think that's the optimal perk for that. Obviously, you want Nature. I think it's probably just the best option all around because it is a vacuum tube weapon, and these weapons are kind of themed around the Nature look, so I wouldn't really pick any other element there. And I did kind of gloss over the reload, but I do think that's necessary. A 2-second reload is pretty good. It just gets you right back into the fight. At 10.8 shots per second, even though you have 50 rounds, you're going to be burning through that magazine very, very fast. I wouldn't suggest a higher mag size because all that would do is delay the inevitable. You're going to have to reload. This is one of the very few weapons where weapon stability actually kind of makes sense because it kicks a lot. So if you find yourself being one of those people who has a little trouble controlling this weapon, you could go stability, and if you really don't mind the reload, then you could do a little bit of extra damage. My preferred is reload, but there's kind of a case to be made for all of these except for durability. Just go far more Sunbeam. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. But that's pretty much it for the vacuum tube sniper. I've probably been calling it the vacuum tube rifle the entire time, which isn't technically inaccurate. However, there is a literal vacuum tube rifle, which I've made a separate video on, link below. So that is a different topic altogether. If you guys want to support the channel, feel free to use code MISTA at your checkout. I'd really appreciate it. Oh, they added a new little message down here warning people about scams. Yeah, you will not receive any specific benefit by using my code. It just supports me a lot more than I can literally share because they don't let you share earnings or anything. And I really appreciate it. I do. If If you guys want to become a channel member, support me here on YouTube, you guys can do so with the join button on the channel, link in the description below, and you can use the emotes now in the comment section, which is pretty awesome. My streams are awesome, so check me out on Twitch, link to that in the description as well. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a nice day. Well, my energy cell count is at 0, so I guess we're talking about the vacuum tube launcher. This thing is pretty awesome. It kind of always has been, and as per usual with the 12.0 update that you've heard me talk about a million times, it got a 40% damage boost. So not only did it get better than it already was when it was already pretty good, but it now has a fancy new Chain Lightning 6 perk. Now, I am going to show the perks that I have on this thing right away, but if you're just coming for the perks, please let me explain myself later down the line. Regardless, this is the copy that was given to me, and we now have the eliminating an enemy causes a Chain Lightning strike up to 6 enemies. Now, it should be noted that if I'm not mistaken, all vacuum tube weapons now have this 6 perk, which includes the shotgun, makes it insanely good, and the sword also makes it insanely good. Both of those will be getting videos on my channel. I can't promise when, but they will be coming out, and if I try to remember, I'll link all my vacuum tube weapon videos in the description below. I think this might be the first one I've covered. And that's, of course, excluding the vacuum tube bow, which has a different 6 perk, where only hitting the enemy can chain a lightning, up to 6 enemies. And that's actually pretty good, because the bow doesn't always eliminate, and that just makes it a lot more effective. You can hit a smasher over and over and chain everything around it. I'm going to link my best bows video where I talk about the vacuum tube bow more, because the video of it itself is quite outdated. It was recorded right when it came out, and they've done a lot of good things to this weapon since. If I record a new video on that, that'll be linked below, and I encourage you to check it out, because I think this weapon deserves some more time in the spotlight. But of course, today, we're talking about the vacuum tube launcher. I already said it's a powerhouse, and that Chain Lightning only allows it to hit more enemies. I don't, off the top of my head, know what all the 6 perk options were, but Editing Beast can put some of them on the screen for you here. I mean, I think you can get Affliction on it, even so, that's not going to help a ton, and the eliminating an enemy chaining out is actually quite effective. Now, I recorded all of my gameplay in an Exploding Death Burst mission, so a lot of the enemies are healing each other, and it doesn't really show as well, but trust me, in an encampment, it's going to look a lot like this one, where there were a lot of baby zombies, and the Exploding Death Burst didn't really affect as much, so you can see that in about 2 shots, it deleted the entire encampment. Now, with some bigger enemies, you're not going to 2-shot every encampment, but if you can group things together, this thing will delete everything, and it makes it a very, very fun weapon to use. But of course, there's always a downside to these weapons, and given my quip at the beginning of this, you can probably figure it is extremely expensive. Holy crap, you are going to burn through your energy cells if you use this like I did. Obviously, I was just showcasing it. I use this weapon a lot more than I really should. You should reserve a launcher if you're using it as a secondary, as like a group area of effect kind of eliminator. You should be saving this for encampments, crowds of zombies, when there are a lot of things all at once, and then clean things up with your shotgun or whatever you're using. That is also a good thing to note that I am using a shotgun loadout in this. I don't like to record these videos with a loadout that buffs rocket launchers in any way, because A, I don't think most people are running that way, and B, I don't think they need a boost. If you do want to make your rocket launchers absolutely insane, I'll link my video down below. It's still relevant. It's worth checking out. You can make launchers way better than you ever knew. Spoiler alert, you're not going to have to reload nearly as often. And no, I'm not talking about the reload glitch. I know it's a thing. It's not going to affect any of my review here. I still recommend a reload perk because they're going to patch it. I wouldn't get used to it. But expanding on that cost, it's not all bad. So yes, you are using 30 energy cells per shot. Yes, even though the deatomizer uses 35 cells per shot, I do think that weapon's a lot more bang for its buck. And I don't love mentioning other weapons to compare because the deatomizer is not what we're talking about, but it's hard to recommend one weapon when a better alternative exists. That said, you are shooting 3 projectiles with this weapon, which actually kind of impacts some of my perk recommendations. And by that, I mean while you're shooting, I've probably shown it a ton in the gameplay already, you can move your cursor, or if you're playing on console, you can move your joystick while you're firing to hit multiple enemies with the same shot in very, very different areas of the map. And that's a really effective way to use this thing. And that impacts the way that I think about this weapon because I never like recommending crit on these weapons, unless it's like the deatomizer, which fires lots of different projectiles, and you can see where I'm going with this. Because you're firing 3 projectiles per shot, I'm assuming those are 3 individual projectiles. So assuming that each of those can crit, I think a crit build might actually work for this weapon. It did pretty well with me on the copy that was given to me, and I like the way that it felt. So regardless of how you perk it, if you're going to span your aim across a crowd of enemies and hit multiples at once, I was able to, depending on how I moved, fire 2 shots, then a third, or 1 shot, then 2, and just kind of time it right to hit enemies a lot more effectively. I found this to be a very, very versatile weapon and a super fun thing to use. Without further ado, though, what are the best perks for this thing? So seeing as this is the only legendary copy that I have, we're going to be going off of a level 12 vacuum tube launcher, but of course you're going to want to max this thing out if you're going to be using it for yourself. I'm going to start with the element. You're probably going to want to go nature. There are a lot of different choices here, but I think the cheapest and easiest option is to just stick with nature on this. It will restrict you to nature and water zones, as you will be doing abysmal damage in a fire zone. So that is something to consider, but that's true for all vacuum tube weapons. I'm assuming you kind of knew that already. As for the 5th perk, you pretty much only have one option if you're not using some of the other 6 perks. So we have damage to affliction and damage to slowed and snared. If you have that 6th perk, it's okay. That's completely fine. I genuinely don't think any 6th perk that this weapon has will cause me to recommend you to not use this weapon. Now, of course, with the damage to slowed and snared or affliction, you are going to have to hit each enemy once in order for that effect to finally be activated with the 2nd shot. As I mentioned, you are shooting 3 shots at a time, so it's not that bad, but it is something to consider that the 45% is appealing when it's maxed out here, but it's not actually 45%. I've explained this in a lot of my other videos, so I'll try to be quick, but essentially when you hit an enemy, you get no bonus. The 2nd shot will be a 45% extra damage, which will average out to be about a 22.5% damage bonus, and then it's only on the 3rd shot that you're actually getting about a 30% damage, you know, on a per shot basis. I've explained this in the past in situations where your alternate option is a damage perk. That's not the case here, but my point is the damage to afflict and slowed and snared sounds nice, but it's not really recommended. So even though I still consider this a usable weapon, even if you have the slowed and snared or damage to affliction 6 perk, I do think you're going to want to look to one of these other options. Now, eliminating an enemy causes a chain lightning strike is really, really good, as I already showed. It's really great for area of effect damage, but dealing 44% bonus damage to water enemies, which, as I said, is what you should be aiming at anyway, is also a really good bonus. I genuinely don't think either of these perks are better than the other. I think that is going to come down to preference. Do you need better single target damage or better group damage with the chain lightning strike? That's up to you. I'm not going to tell you which one to use because I think they're both great. As for the 5th perk, obviously you want slowed and snared or affliction. Just match it to your 6th perk depending on what copy you have. If you're using a chain lightning or a damage to water element, then honestly there are a couple of options here. So the damage to stun, staggered, or frozen is something that rarely gets any attention. However, because this is a vacuum tube weapon, I don't know if you noticed this, but you're actually stunning enemies with this. I'm not entirely certain if that's every single hit. If it is, that's great, but it's kind of the same thing I talked about with the damage to affliction. So you could do that extra damage to stunned enemies, seeing as you're going to be stunning them constantly, but it's only going to be active after your first shot, and I already explained that. So my recommendation is probably damage to mist monsters and bosses, because that is where you're going to be having the most trouble. I think I had to test this in a 132 zone, as there weren't any water elements in the 140 zones. In the 132 zone, as you can see, I wasn't really having any trouble with any enemy whatsoever. So frankly, I think the damage to mist monsters and bosses is something that you could put on here safely and never have to think about again. Just know that mist monsters, and especially smashers, are just going to be a lot easier to take down. Not to mention, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but they are rarely elemental, so that's also something to consider, that extra damage could make up for some loss there. I'm going to skip to this middle perk because I think it's kind of obvious. Reload. You're going to want to reload on this. Just trust me. You don't want to spend too much time out of the fight. If you don't care about a slow reload, then extra damage is a win. That's just an easy answer. Don't go durability. It's just not worth it, in my opinion. If you're going to be using this in the late game, I'm hoping you can afford it. You know what? No. If you're using the vacuum tube launcher with the sheer amount of energy cells that this thing takes, you could afford to craft another. All right, I highly recommend reload or damage depending on your preference. I'll be going reload, no questions asked. And that brings me to the crit build versus damage. So double damage is always what I recommend for launchers, just because one shot is all you get. You don't want to roll the dice hoping you crit, but you're shooting 3 times with this, and I think that's something to consider. Frankly, I don't really think it matters. Crit rating, crit damage will be the better option in the long run. You will do a total damage output that's higher than double damage, and seeing as based on what I observed and what I figure, each of those 3 shots you fire have their own chance to crit. On average, with a 38% chance to crit, not guaranteed, but on average, you will be critting every single time you fire this weapon. And that enough is good enough for me to run crit build on this. I think that's a safe way to go. If you want total consistent damage and you don't want to trust crits, even though they're pretty reliable, you of course can go double damage, and trust me, you're going to be just fine. Hell, the vacuum tube bow that I mentioned earlier, you might have noticed I run triple damage on it. I never switched it back to crit because it was doing just fine. I never noticed a difference, and we're talking about like 9% 9% damage difference here. It's really not that big of a deal. I haven't done the math for the launcher itself, but on the old SMGs we used to test back in the day, 9% was a pretty consistent difference between double damage and crit rate and crit damage. Even if that number is off, it's a pretty small amount. So that's my final recommendation. If all of that was very confusing, let me break it down in the simplest way possible. Eliminating an enemy causes a chain lightning, and weapon hits deal damage to water enemies. Those are the two that you want. In that case, you want damage to miss monsters and bosses, or damage to stunned, staggered, frozen. That's kind of up to you guys. I recommend a crit build. I think it's better than double damage, but double damage is good anyway. I recommend a reload, but if you're okay with a slow reload time, or if you're one of those people abusing the reload glitch, then of course you can just roll a damage perk on this, at least temporarily. Obviously, I recommend nature, as it's kind of your only option, but that's pretty much it. Kind of a long video for a pretty intricate weapon. Very, very cool. I'm glad that they made an old weapon better and then better again. Like, the 40% damage buff was enough. Now, not a lot of people were using this weapon, but adding these extra 6 perks really make it a better experience. And for those of you who didn't already know, as I'm recording this, it is a researchable weapon. You can go down here, and you know what? I might even do it just for the video, because I would love a copy of this with a new 6 perk. You can just research it just like that. Head over to your schematics, check what you got. I got snared. So, yeah, I mean, I am gambling, but it would have been cool if I got one of the fancy new 6 perks, but you yourself could go and get one of those yourself. If you guys enjoyed this video, feel free to use code MYSTICH to check out. As of recording this, Epic has just filed suit against Apple. This isn't really news that I'm going to be covering in this video. It's totally off topic, but it has made it so that all V-Bucks are 20% off permanently. Kind of cool. And the split that creators are getting as of recording is still the same as it always was. So please, I'm going to reinforce, use code MYSTICH to check out if you're taking advantage of these cheaper V-Bucks. This is apparently not a sale, and they're claiming this is permanent. So pretty cool on Epic, I guess. Way off topic for this video, but something I figured I should mention, seeing as I am asking you to use my codes. You should know what's going on with that. If you guys want to be a channel member, you can absolutely do that. I have been streaming on Twitch recently, so I'll be linking that below, of course. You can check out my streams there. I tag on Discord every time I go live, but if you want to get some nice member perks, you can see them there. Click the join button if you want to support me. Thank you guys so much for watching this longer video than usual. I hope you guys enjoyed, and have a nice day. Oh man, have I been looking forward to this. The vacuum tube bow, the weapon I did dirty so long ago, except that I kind of didn't. So let me explain. When this weapon was out on its very first day, I made what is typically a very bad sign, and that was a short video on this weapon. Nowadays, I always try to stretch it to 8 minutes because it turns out you can put in an extra ad and then feeding myself becomes easier. So I appreciate you guys watching. But back in the day, if a weapon didn't keep my interest and I didn't have much to say, 3.5 minutes was about as long as the video would get. And I don't really regret that, because when the vacuum tube weapon came out, it was bad. So when the vacuum tube bow came out, the chain lightning only activated when you eliminated an enemy, and it had a 4-second cooldown. And this was extremely disappointing, because when bows were first coming out, they were pretty bad. I mean, the boom bow didn't impress, and the compression burster was actually called the depression burster by Tic Tac when he covered it, and that pretty much says it all. It was basically just a worse boom bow, and that was basically the trend that bows were going in. And I always said from the very beginning, you should make a bow chain lightning to other enemies. I will continue to say, like, I specifically said, make a bow chain to other enemies, give you some method of like area of effect, and that's essentially what they did with the vacuum tube bow. Remember, Pharah was not anywhere in anybody's mind at that point. I don't know if the devs were working on her. Well, I actually do know that, because Matt just said that they introduced the bows with the idea in mind that they would create a hero that affects all of them. So I guess Pharah was planned at the very beginning, but not released until later. My point is, Pharah did exactly what I wanted. She made it so that it changed to other enemies, but the vacuum tube bow did it as well, and I was so disappointed with this weapon because it didn't really do that as well. Eliminating an enemy was kind of tough for a bow, especially without Pharah, and giving that chain a 4-second cooldown was brutal. So the vacuum tube bow was historically just a really, really big flop right out of the gate. They had a very fantastic weapon idea and then flopped. But the update came around, I don't actually remember when it was, but the update came around and made this weapon activate after hitting an enemy with no cooldown, and I'm not sure if this was exactly how it functioned originally, but it would strike up to 6 enemies. On day 1, it felt more like they were rolling a dice, but nowadays it will chain to as many enemies as it can, and if there are only 2 enemies in range, it'll actually chain between those 2 enemies, capping out at 6. So it is a very, very effective bonus. Now, there was a brief period of time where they made it so that when Pharah's, chain happened, it also triggered the lightning. That would strike up to about 30 enemies and was way more powerful than the devs thought it should be. So I understand why they patched it, but goodness, this weapon was god tier when that was a thing. So a lot of people are still salty about them patching that, but I'd rather a weapon be very, very good than debatably overpowered. They didn't really make the weapon bad, they just didn't make it as broken as they did. So I am okay with where the vacuum tube bow landed. Some people aren't, but that's okay. So hopefully that recap wasn't too bad. I like to give a little bit of a history on these weapons, and the vacuum tube bow has always had a place in my heart of regret because they made the update where it fixed that 6 perk a long, long time ago, but the hype for this weapon never really went up until it was broken, and I didn't want to cover it when it was broken, but then the hype went up in the worst direction because people were really angry about the weapon after they patched it, and so I never really found a good time to talk about this weapon, also considering the fact that it never technically re-released, which is actually a good thing, because if you look at the collection book, you can go down to the expansion schematics right now, down to the vacuum tube weapons, and I'm not certain if you can research it. No, it appears you need a voucher, but you can get the vacuum tube bow from regular llamas. So if you actually go to the llama shop, you might see it in one of your upgrade llamas someday, so that is something to look out for. Now, on the topic of whether or not you should use a voucher on it, that is totally up to you. I'm going to link the weapon voucher video down below. You can figure it out from there. But the vacuum tube bow, let's talk about it a little bit more. Obviously, it chains lightning. That's obviously a given. That's something we've mentioned a lot here. And being a vacuum tube weapon, it is locked to nature, so it's going to be very effective against water enemies, which is partially why I'm recording this video now, and probably why I should have recorded it like a week ago, because we are currently in a frost area mission thing. Let me go to the map and show you. So because it's December, it's the winter season, just about every single 4-player has a water modifier on it, meaning water zombies will be spawning like crazy. So that ice storm is just on every single mission, and this includes ventures. So having a lightning bow is a pretty good pick, and it is very, very powerful. We were running this 160 retrieve the data earlier, and boy, this vacuum tube bow was very, very effective in the hands of my teammates and myself while we were running that mission. So the vacuum tube bow was a very good pick. And if you're going to be using that weapon, let's talk about the perks you should put on it. So the vacuum tube bow is much like all the other bows where a crit build is pretty standard, but let's talk about it a little bit and explain why I'm running what I'm running, because a lot of people very early on like to recommend double crit rating, double crit damage. And while I understand the idea behind that, you want to, up the chance that it's going to crit, that really only makes sense if you're running Sub-Zero Zenith with this build, which can work, I guess, if you want to freeze your enemies in place. It's kind of a good combo with a nature weapon. But I don't really recommend it at all, because you're going to lose 2 things. In the very beginning, fire rate didn't exist, but you will be losing the fire rate and you will be losing the reload speed. And reload speed is extremely important with bows because it is essentially your fire rate. Your fire rate on this bow is 2.5, but it doesn't really matter because the reload is going to be slowing that down by even more. And that is also to say that the charge time is a thing. I should have mentioned this at some point earlier, but I will state it now that if you are trying to get that chain lightning to activate, you do need the bow to be drawn at least halfway, like it says here. So be sure to be always drawing it halfway if you're trying to get it to chain. That will also increase the damage based on how far you draw it. I'm not certain how to tell when it's fully drawn back. Maybe somebody in the comments can let you know. I'll pin any corrections or if we find out down below, so you guys can always check the pin comment for any updated news. So I definitely recommend a reload perk. If you, for some reason, do not care about reload and can totally go without it, then a second crit damage would be really, really helpful. But I also used to run this weapon, reload fire rate, double damage, and that is also completely fine. It is less DPS, and you won't be critting for 1,000,000 damage if you run all damage, but it will be very consistent damage output. And while I don't recommend it, you can do it and it's not going to matter. I do not believe that the lightning crits, so if that does crit at some point, then a crit build is going to be even more fantastic, but I don't really recommend it. The argument that I always make for crit builds is that when you hit an enemy with a bow, usually, even with a crit, you're not going to one-shot it. Now, I'm not talking about the normal enemies. They're going to get deleted by the lightning. I'm talking about the enemies that really matter. Smashers, mist monsters, husks, the fat husks, the mini-bosses. Those are the ones that are going to be taking multiple shots. And if you're going to be taking multiple shots anyway, it stands to figure that at some point you are going to crit. So I've switched this to crit build and honestly preferred it. There are times where, and I wasn't exaggerating, with a full party of like other 130 pluses, I was able to crit for 1,000,000 damage. That's especially possible if you hit for the head, because it does about triple damage, a little bit less than 2.5 or so. It is definitely preferred to go with a crit build on this for those reasons. Now, you could do like double crit damage, even though you'd lose the reload if you want to run totally rocking out with a bow build like this, but I'm not 100% certain that that's too necessary, but that is a way that people can run it. And fire rate might also be a little bit debatable. So some people might not prefer fire rate. I think that being able to draw this weapon faster and have it draw to full even faster is much preferred. Every time I've ever switched to fire rate, I've preferred it. In fact, I run it on the Xenon Bow as well, which is a weapon that could use a little bit more oomph when you're trying to shoot through multiple enemies, but hey, I guess that's why I supercharged it, right? So you could even see that the Vacuum Tube Bow is doing more damage than the Xenon Bow, and it's not even supercharged. So yeah, the Xenon Bow shoots through multiple enemies, so it's not exactly the same comparison, but the Vacuum Tube Bow clearly doesn't really need any more help as it is. So that's pretty much the best perks for this. You can roll fire rate double damage, you could do reload triple damage. I can't recommend any situation where you're not running a reload perk on this. That's just my personal opinion. If you think, screw this guy, then sure, go double crit damage, but I warned you, you will be reloading very slow, and your teammate next to you running reload will be popping off a lot more shots, and they'll probably be a lot more effective. So that's the Vacuum Tube Bow. If you guys want to support the channel, feel free to use code MIST at your checkout. If you guys want to become a channel member, you can do so here with the join button or the link in the description below. You guys can use those emotes down in the comments. Check out my streams. They're awesome. We have a pretty good time. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a nice day. You know, every once in a while when I record these videos, people on my streams are starting to notice, link to the Twitch down below, that when I record some of these videos, I get gifts while I'm in the middle of getting an intro done. But instead of covering the Vacuum Tube Axe, Aphid sending me an... Okay, that rarely happens while I'm recording, but thank you to Aphid. I'm going to leave it in. Screw it. Twitch knows what I'm talking about, where every once in a while, I kill enemies a little too fast with a weapon. This has happened with the crit explosion melees in the past, and this is not a crit explosion weapon, but what happened with the Vacuum Tube Axe is I happened to find, let's take a journey to the map, because I happened to find a water mission, and that's interesting because most of the 4-player missions are all Firestorm right now. Now this is super right now, like within the next month, if you're watching this in September or later, it's probably not all Firestorm, so I'm a little curious if it's going to be a good idea to release a Vacuum Tube weapon video in this time. But I uncovered this resupply mission where there is A, no healing death burst, which means chain lightning can go crazy, and B, Ice Storm, which means I'm going to be hitting for the most damage every time. And that combination made the Vacuum Tube Axe one of those weapons where it was doing a little too much damage too fast, where I had covered most of the map and only had about 4 minutes of gameplay. So what all of that means is this weapon is way stronger than I expected it to be. Now, I obviously mentioned the chain lightning already, and you've probably already been seeing the gameplay. The Vacuum Tube Axe has a very high base damage, meaning my weapon is hitting for about 40,000 damage. That is about 14,000 more damage than the Storm King's Ravager, if you need a little bit of something to compare to there. And that means that the chain lightning is actually doing a little bit more damage than usual. So it's essentially one-shotting the normal zombies while adding up to do a lot of damage to the fatties. And I can't even tell you how many encampments I recorded today where they just died before I even knew it was happening. And I am so excited to share the Vacuum Tube Axe with you guys. Now, it should be added that the Vacuum Tube Spear will likely have a similar effect, and basically any vacuum tube weapon is like this. Anybody who's used the Vacuum Tube Bow along with Stoneheart Farah has probably noticed that it is an insanely powerful combo. Now, that's a specific thing where her branching out does stack, and I know that this is a really old clip that I've shown before, but that has actually been reverted, and it is chaining just like it is in this old clip nowadays, and all the Vacuum Tube weapons are basically as strong as that, but they don't chain with Stoneheart Farah the way the bow does. I'm just saying, if you've used the Vacuum Tube Bow, you know how good chain lightning is. And of course, the Vacuum Tube Axe isn't any different, but it is wildly surprising to me. Now, of course, we are using Paleoluna. In fact, I'll actually get into the loadout here. If you guys watched my recent Armageddon Axe video, you'll note that this is a very similar loadout. Like I said in that video, I try to do this for consistency. I try to use kind of the same build on everything, and I know that Luna makes everything good, but I don't think she was helping the chain lightning at all. And I actually have, you know, Dennis Jr. on here because he's back from his expedition, and I actually have something really cool to add with this. Axe eliminations have an 11% chance to grant Rock and Riff, increasing your damage and melee attack speed. What I found is the chain lightning counts. I might have been misreading this. There could be a chance I'm incorrect on this, but from what I could tell, if I eliminated an enemy, I didn't always see that bonus activate immediately, but what was happening is the chain lightning went off, killing, I mean, up to 6 enemies is really how many you can hit at once, and if one of those enemies activates this ability, we're good to go. And that means that you are almost always, if you have a good enough crowd of enemies and you're not in a healing death burst mission, you're almost always going to have that ability active. So while this isn't a Dennis Jr. video, I highly recommend him if you have him available. And as I mentioned with the time-sensitive Firestorm missions, he is currently in the shop, so you could just go grab him right now. I haven't, because I've already got him in the book and I've already got one that I can use, but if you haven't purchased Dennis Jr., I definitely recommend it because he will make this weapon stronger. Now, on the topic of making this weapon stronger, let's get into the best perks for the Vacuum Tube Axe if you're trying to optimize your gameplay. Now, first and foremost, there are actually other 6 perk options. I think the real MVP is definitely eliminating an enemy. In fact, I actually put this up to a Twitch poll to let them decide which 6 perk I should record with today, and without a surprise, everybody wanted to see Chain Lightning, but it is worth mentioning that the extra 44% damage to water enemies 6 perk is very strong. If you're only using your Vacuum Tube Axe in specifically Ice Storm missions, which is generally recommended, you can do 44% more damage to those enemies. And I think overall, on average, the Chain Lightning will give you more extra damage than that. It's still an option, and it's definitely not something I'm going to not mention. And if you have Causes to Affliction, that is also a very strong 6 perk. Much like Stoneheart Pharah getting reverted to chaining along with the Chain Lightning like she used to, they also put Affliction back to its buffed damage. So it's actually, so long as you're tagging a lot of enemies with your axe, going to give you a ton of extra damage. So you can only hit every enemy once in a big group, and they'll all tick away to Affliction damage, probably dying from it. Obviously, Chain Lightning will have a more automatic way of doing that similar thing. It's still worth mentioning, and if you're using Affliction, you can use the damage to afflicted targets 5th perk. I'm using the damage to miss monsters and bosses because I think that was the most useful. All Vacuum Tube weapons have a built-in stun, which you would have seen throughout the gameplay, so damage to stun, staggered, frozen can kind of help you, but it's not super consistent, so a 60% damage bonus to only some enemies isn't that big of a deal in my opinion, and if they've already been stunned by your Vacuum Tube Axe, they've already taken sufficient enough damage to where their days are numbered anyway. So I don't really think that 5th perk is necessary, but it's totally optional. You can use whatever you want. I just figured the damage to miss monsters and bosses was just a nice 36% bonus to the enemies that are really going to give you trouble. Double attack speed, if you've seen my Masamune video or my new Ravager video, is absolutely the best combo to go for if you're running Paleoluna. The faster you swing, the more she'll help you, but if you're using Totally Rockin' Out, you might be able to get away with double crit damage. Just know that this thing has like a 0.9 swing speed, which is really, really slow. So even if you're using Totally Rockin' Out, maybe attack speed and 1 crit damage perk would be the way to go. I just think you need to swing a little quicker at least to get that ball rolling. So like attack speed, crit damage would still leave you with a 0.77, but that swing speed is like a whole second. Mine was 0.9 when I was leveling it up. Looks like I was wrong. You are swinging once per second, which is incredibly slow, super clunky, and not something I'd recommend. I know that Totally Rockin' Out makes you swing faster, but you would need the ability to be active 24/7, and that's just not super practical. So I'm going to recommend at least an attack speed perk, but you can kind of change that up if you so please. If you're not using Paleoluna, you can try to do attack speed, maybe crit damage as well, because even with Whiteout Fiona and no crit rating perks, we're getting up to a 42.5% chance to crit, which is really, really high. That's nearly every other hit, and that's plenty high in my opinion. So even 1 crit damage perk will go a long way. Although if you're using Luna in the lead, double attack speed is the best way to go damage-wise. And then, of course, in the middle perk here, damage is just, in my opinion, the best way to go. The heavy attack was not anything to write home about. Movement speed and life leech and all that is nice, I guess, but I'd just rather do more damage and not even think twice about it. As for the element, I think nature is just the best one to go. It's really, really fitting to the Vacuum Tube Axe theme, because if you've actually looked at the models of these weapons, they all have this glowy lightning bit in it, so it makes sense to run nature on these. I don't think any other perk would really make sense. So that just about wraps it up for the Vacuum Tube Axe. I am blown away by how powerful this thing was. Again, there are a couple of things, like without healing Death Burst, Chain Lightning is super powerful, and I was in an Ice Storm mission, so it was at its best, but still, those are the perfect combinations for these weapons to shine and can really show you just how good the Vacuum Tube Axe really is. And if you guys want to support the channel, feel free to use code MYSTIC to checkout. It really helps me. I really do appreciate it. It helps me continue making these videos, and yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. I made this video on stream, so if you guys want to follow my Twitch, link down below, subscribe for more, and yeah, take it easy. I am so excited to finally talk about this melee. The Fortsville Slug, just kidding, Acorn. We're talking about the Vacuum Tube Sword. This thing is one of those weapons that, oh, how do I even get into it? It is not a top tier melee, alright? I'll tell you that right now. But that is kind of old news because of the new 6 perk, as you probably won't be surprised to hear, because it is a pretty okay sword, okay? I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's not great on its own, but with Paleoluna, as per usual, she makes pretty much everything with a high swing speed usable. Now, you don't need Paleoluna to make this thing good. However, the way that we're going to perk it today, we'll talk about that later. But with the new 6 perk, when you eliminate an enemy, as you've seen, it chains to other enemies. And I want to provide a little bit of a disclaimer for the enemies that will be in my video today. I like to showcase these weapons in the highest end zones, and a problem with the chaining is that it doesn't really scale with the damage output, and it seems to do about the same amount no matter where you are. So if you're in a lower zone, the chain lightning will be a lot more effective at eliminating more enemies consistently. And in the video you'll be seeing today, a lot of these enemies don't really die from that extra chain damage. So it won't look like it's doing a ton, but I'd like you to take special note of the fact that a lot of these enemies will definitely be weaker when I switch to them in the pack. And even with the nurse zombies, they're not doing nearly as much as they normally do, you know, because they're healing everything around you. It usually just obliterates any chance of a melee doing anything useful here. But because of that chain lightning damage just chipping away at every enemy all at once, or at least up to 6 of them all at once, it's actually really effective, and it makes this weapon super, super usable. And I'm so happy. That's a lot of raving for one weapon, but I can't overstate just how much fun I've been having with this sword. I finally got a copy for myself, and here we are making a video on it. Now, I have been offered copies of this weapon a ton. Thank you to every single person who's reached out in the comments or on Discord or in stream offering me a copy of this weapon. I do appreciate it, but when it comes to this game, everybody just, you know, you want to have your own copy, right? And with the vacuum tube sword, much like the vacuum tube launcher, you can even go to the collection book right down here to the expansion schematics, go to the vacuum tube weapons section, and you can recruit a copy for yourself. I won't demonstrate this like I did in the vacuum tube launcher video, but suffice it to say, just research an epic version of this and then go to evolve it, check that 6 perk and see if it'll have anything useful. Much like this Maverick that I've set aside. It has that new stunning or knocking back 6 perk. I'm considering trying it. I don't know, I've set it aside, but I can already see the 6 perk before I even change it. Kind of a cool trick and a good way to save your legendary flux. Getting back to the vacuum tube sword though, there's really not much to add. That extra chain lightning is extremely useful, but how you want to perk it is really important. So I ran double attack speed. This probably won't surprise anybody, as we recently found that double attack speed, or even triple attack speed if possible with Paleoluna, is the highest damage output. And like most swords, this is why I mentioned you're kind of going to want Luna regardless. You can't really run crit rate and crit damage on this thing and maintain an attack speed perk, which means you're going to have a bit of a trade-off. I truly, truly do not recommend a crit build over double attack speed, even if you're not using Paleoluna. Double attack speed is probably going to be extra effective. I haven't ran the numbers on that. If you're not using Paleoluna, perhaps attack speed double damage might be the best way to go. But I can't really see a way to use this weapon without using Paleoluna. And there is good news for everybody watching this video. Upon release, Paleoluna, if I'm not mistaken, is right there in the shop. This will be true up until about September 8th. That's the current date that's been sort of not really announced, but it's been announced. You know how Magus likes to talk to people on Reddit. Very helpful. I'm glad that he does that, but, you know, maybe September 8th is a figure that should, like, be here somewhere. I don't know. Just an idea. But regardless, what that means is you'll be able to buy Paleoluna shortly after this video is uploaded if you're watching from the future. I apologize if you don't have Paleoluna. I don't really know a great way to use this weapon other than, as I already mentioned, double damage attack speed is actually probably a pretty good way to go. You're definitely going to want an attack speed on this weapon. But of course, all you got to do is eliminate an enemy before it chains to every other enemy, and that makes it just a great crowd clearing weapon. Now, you do have other 6 perk options, and I can't really sign off on any of them. Obviously, if you have Affliction or Slowed and Snared, you can match the 6 perk to damage to Afflicted or Slowed and Snared. That's great extra damage, but without that group damage from the Chain Lightning, this weapon is no longer special and not really something that would make its way into my hands personally. I only like to use weapons that are fun and really effective, or both. That would be great, obviously, to have both, and this one seems to fit the bill. And the damage to water enemies is also kind of nice. That's the only one, just like the vacuum tube launcher, that I would maybe consider using instead of the chain lightning, because that 44% extra damage isn't literally 40% because of the way the damage stacks in this game, but for the sake of argument, the 44% extra damage is nice. It's a lot of extra damage. I can't showcase this as I don't have a copy, but regardless, things would be dying a whole heck of a lot faster. So fast that you might not need that chain lightning. I like the idea of hitting the front of an enemy at a chain of zombies and then just watching them all get hit by that lightning. That is incredibly satisfying to me personally, but I think that 44% damage could compete fairly well. But one of you might be saying, Beast, that you have a 45% damage to Afflict and Slow Insert as well. What about that? Well, that only takes place after the first hit, and so you're going to have to hit every single enemy at least once before you even get that effect. And you're going to have to hit them like 2 or 3 times more before you're actually averaging to the amount of extra damage that you would have been getting in the first place with the damage to water enemies. Of course, everything I've just said there only applies to water enemies, as it only affects water enemies, and so there is a little bit of trade-off in every single direction. That's why I think the Chain Lightning might just be the best all around, because it's going to chain to any enemy regardless of its element, and it's going to help you no matter what. As for the 5th perk, you can see we went damage to Mist Monsters and Bosses here. I think that's your best bet. Obviously, the Chain Lightning is going to clean up all of the baby zombies. They're going to die immediately. All the normal zombies are going to go pretty quick. The Husky Husks are going to take a little bit more attention, but the Mist Monsters are what's really not going to care about your Chain Lightning. They're the ones that you are going to need the most help on, and I can't really see a better perk for this spot, seeing as you're not really going to be stunning, staggering, or freezing targets all that much. It's not like the Vacuum Tube Launcher where you have that stunning effect. If I'm not mistaken, it doesn't say it in here, you're not going to be stunning any enemies with a sword, so I think the damage to Mist Monsters and Bosses is not only our best option, seeing as none of the others really help us, but it's also a pretty good one, because every time I went up to a Mist Monster, I was like, aha! Every time I went up to a Mist Monster, I was pretty excited, seeing like, hey, I got a perk for this. This is going to be a little bit easier than before. And then, of course, the damage perk in the middle is, again, just kind of our only option. I mean, armor, durability, life leech, movement speed. You can pick if any of this is something that fits your playstyle more. Maybe you're somebody who's spamming the heavy attack, which I didn't find to be all that special. I mean, of course, the heavy attack does more damage, but it's not really needed. And it locks you into an animation that perhaps would be faster to just swing it normally. I wasn't wildly impressed. I'm definitely going to recommend a damage perk here, and I'll probably leave it the same. I do want to reiterate at the end here that double attack speed is really only recommended if you're using Paleoluna, as she is what is providing a lot of your regular damage. So, of course, if you're not using Paleoluna, then, of course, double damage and attack speed would probably be a pretty good way to go. That's the Vacuum Tube Sword, you guys. Really excited about this weapon. It's one of those weapons where I just spent all this time talking about perks, but perks are the least interesting thing. I perk it like this, didn't think twice, threw on a Luna loadout, and that was awesome. I will go over some of the heroes that I used in this loadout. I showed it on screen already, but Assassin Sarah is what I recommend, and of course, Legendary Blade is just nice. Not everybody might have the Mythic, but some extra sword damage is always nice to have. I'll link my old Best Ninja loadout video down below. It is missing some of the newer heroes in the game, but regardless, if you follow what I talk about in that video, you're going to wind up with an amazing loadout. None of the heroes in that video got any worse. It's just that some other newer options have come out, like Monster Smash, for example, but even getting some life leech from your attacks is not really that big of a deal, and I don't personally use it all that much regardless. And a lot of people bring out the fact that Paleoluna went from a 16.5% bonus down to a 9%. It really wasn't a nerf, as they buffed ability damage from heroes in the exact same update, and Blast from the Past gave you a little bit more health, if I'm not mistaken. So Luna either broke even or didn't really get all that much worse, or she got better. Nobody really did the math, frankly, but I haven't noticed a difference, and she still kicks ass. So there you go. Those are the perks of the Vacuum Tube Sword and the loadout that I used. If you guys want to support the channel, feel free to use code MISTA to check out. I'd really appreciate it. If you guys want to become a channel member, you can see all the perks right here. I do stream on Twitch more so nowadays, so I'll have that link down below if you guys want to catch a live stream. Obviously, becoming a channel member does have better perks if I'm streaming on YouTube, but you do still get some nice perks like the member badge in the comments, and hopefully someday they'll allow you to use the channel emotes in the comment section as well, which would be pretty cool. Regardless, I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a nice day.
Whoa! A best perks video. If you're watching this because you wanted the best perks for the spear, then you probably don't know what's going on, but I haven't recorded one of these in months, and yeah, it's probably because I covered almost all the weapons, so link to the playlist down below. But we're talking about the Vacuum Tube Spear. It brought me out of unofficial retirement. Yeah, this weapon is way better than you might have ever thought. I have covered most of the Vacuum Tube weapons on my channel, and of course the notable favorites are like the Vacuum Tube Bow and the AR, and the pistol's super strong, the shotgun's really good, the Chain Lightning really makes these weapons way better than they normally would be. I ran the math on the Vacuum Tube Spear, and with the perks that we're running, we'll talk about them later, it is honestly not the highest ranked melee I've ever looked at. I'm not even trying to convince you guys this is some new S tier weapon that's been lurking, but it is very strong, quite usable in the 160s. I have used this weapon on stream many times for my 164 player missions, and okay, 1v1 versus a 250 power level smasher, not going to be doing the most damage on that thing, but the crowd clearing is where it's at. As you've been seeing in this gameplay, I mostly saw basic, like, smaller grouped zombies in here. I wish I would have gotten some better footage. I might get some better ones if I go back through the process of getting gameplay, but it is, as you can probably tell, really good at hitting a single enemy and almost eliminating everything with one shot, and that is extremely important, because if the DPS isn't that impressive, what makes up for it is the chain lightning one-shotting multiple enemies. You can hit one target and kill 7 zombies. That is how strong the chain lightning can be. In encampments, this weapon is invaluable. Obviously, it's locked to nature as a vacuum tube weapon. That's part of its shtick, so it's probably something you're only going to want to use in the water missions. And similar to the vacuum tube axe video, which I know most of you haven't seen because it's the least popular best perks on my channel, it is really, really good in not healing death burst missions. You want that chain lightning to actually stick. If they are healing each other constantly, it makes it really, really tough. The chain lightning weapons have trouble with that because healing death bursts, of course, they're healing themselves. You typically want to focus on one enemy at a time. But if you have the perfect combo, the perfect trio, smoke screen encouraging you to use melee, water encouraging you to use nature, and no healing death bursts, vacuum tube spear is a great pick. So it is definitely something I want you to consider. So the perks for this thing are going to be very standard. That's why I'm showing them so early in the video. Double attack speed is kind of where it's at. We've talked about this a lot on the channel, and this video, at least for the perks section, is going to be a lot more about the actual loadout rather than the weapon itself. Obviously, you're stuck to nature. You can't really change that, but double attack speed is the best because of Luna. If you don't want to use Luna, you can run double crit damage on this. You can do a totally rocking out build. I'm not certain if I'd recommend that. Your attack speed would be pretty slow on that, going down to like 0.8 per second. It's going to be super, super bad. You know, totally rocking out can make up for that, but it might not be active 100% of the time. So while I can't recommend double crit damage, you can do crit damage, but you won't have an attack speed perk. I really believe double attack speed is the only logical way to go here, and then just take advantage of how broken Luna is. Damage is also recommended here. Armor, durability, life leech movement, all of this is not really going to help you at all. The heavy attack is nothing that we're concerned about in this build. It's one of those things where the time it takes you to activate the heavy attack ability is so long that the amount of damage you would have done if you would have just kept attacking normally is more than it would have done if you would have heavy attacked. So damage perk here is just easy pickings. And the 6th perk is where things change. So the lightning strike is obviously what I'm recommending. That crowd clearing is amazing. However, honestly, affliction, super good, super strong. And if you want to run that, damage to afflicted is the way to go. Now, there might be better weapons for this option here. I don't know if you should run vacuum tube spear with affliction. I feel like you got better options. I'm kind of focusing on the tube spear as one of the few weapons that has chain lightning, and that gives it a really nice niche. But if you have an affliction copy and you want to just go for it, maybe you're saving up for a core perk, or you don't want to spend it on this weapon, but you still want to give it a try, affliction is actually okay. And I actually consider affliction to be a decent crowd clearing 6th perk because you can just hit every enemy once, just swing through a crowd. Each swing can hit multiple enemies, so you can just attack all of them very easily, and affliction will chip away while you move on to other targets. And of course, extra damage to affliction will give you a 45% bonus to any of the enemies that you have to return to. Another thing worth noting with the vacuum tube weapons is that the damage to stun, stagger, and frozen is actually kind of considerable because these weapons can stun enemies. It's not super reliable. I wouldn't recommend a whole 5th perk based around that, but it's an option if you want to go for it. But I highly recommend the damage to miss monsters and bosses, as that's super consistent. If we're not going to be running affliction, damage to miss monsters, those are the enemies that are going to need that extra damage. We're already essentially one-shotting every other zombie type up to huskies, so I don't think it's super necessary. And then of course we also have the 44% damage against water elemental enemies. That one's tricky to suggest because a lot of your damage is coming from Luna. This weapon is doing, you know, tens of thousands of damage per hit. It's actually pretty decent as far as melees go. A lot of the swords in the game have lower damage, higher attack speed. This weapon is a lot more balanced, and that's why the chain lightning is so effective. But that 44% damage might not be ideal because, like I said, that is not where your damage is coming from. It's really the attack speed that is the winner here. So since I've talked about this for so long, let's get into the loadout I'm using. I did record my gameplay with a 144 Paleo Luna, so if this weapon looks, you know, slightly better than other melees on my channel, that's why. But the key thing here is, of course, Blast in the Past. That extra damage from Luna is monstrous. That's why we got the double attack speed. Saurian Hide just to keep us healthy, and then of course Saurian Vigor kind of sucks. She is really not great, but you can see that we don't really have better options. We're not using Southie because there's nothing in this loadout that's demanding any energy usage. Saurian Fight, we're not using abilities. Obviously, we're not using a ranged weapon, so Saurian Instinct is kind of the last option besides Vigor, and again, we're not using abilities. So as terrible as Vigor is in this current version of the game, it's unfortunately just our best option, so that's what I went with. Coconuts, of course, keeps us healthy, gives us extra damage. It's a massive win. I have talked about coconuts a lot on this channel. It has been a while since I have reviewed the coconuts versus survivalist argument, and it seems a lot of people on my channel have forgotten. Survivalist is going to give you like 10, maybe 20,000 per tick. If you kill one enemy, you'll maybe get 60,000 health, and it does not stack. Every kill only extends the timer. They do not stack together, so it is absolutely insufficient to keep you alive in the middle of a fight in the 160s. That is where I test my builds. At least for the gameplay, I do 140s, but I get my opinion of these weapons in the 164 players with a full party. So I take these weapons to the highest end of the game, and I try to see if it'll actually hold up. And Coconuts is far better than Survivalist. You get about 30% of your health instantly, and then it heals over 30 seconds at the rate of faster than 2 campfires, I believe. So it's very good. It's highly, highly recommended. And when you're using a melee, it could be nice to have like a rocket launcher secondary, but it could be a thing in the future that coconuts will work in the utility slot, so that's not even a big deal anymore. As for the other perks, well, there aren't really a lot of options when it comes to spears. There are a couple, and I don't even remember what they are because they're really, really bad. Every time you look into them, it's just disappointing. Yeah. So we're not honestly going to use any of them. Assassination is fine. It's kind of whatever. It just gives you extra melee damage in general, which is a nice perk. Each attack just sort of gives you more damage. It's nice to have. And Battle Beat might be a surprising pick, but remember that attack speed is where we're getting so much of our damage output, so swinging quicker is really, really nice. And killing 10 enemies in 9 seconds is pretty easy considering that Chain Lightning does what it does. So all around, this build keeps you going, and it is super strong. So yeah, Vacuum Tube Spear. I said I'd make this video, and I'm making it now. I'm glad to cover it. I hope some of you guys actually try it out because I really recommend this weapon. If you guys want to support the channel, you know, these videos take a lot of work. Normally I'd show my creator code here, but I support Archer, so here I'll just enable this. There you go. Code Mystich at checkout. I really appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
And then